So good evening here in the room and online. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our third FeBinar, the talks organized as part of our ERC FIBO project, funded by the European Research Council and hosted by the Department of Humanities at the University of Trento. FIBO aims at exploring the multifaceted strategies applied by Greek federal states in order to help secure stability and inner cohesion by managing the different challenges posed by the league's internal and external borders in a flexible manner. In order to shed new light on border management policies and cultures, we are especially interested in the role played by techniques of balance of power, as well as networks of informal political actors who crossed the borders on a regular basis and invigorated border spaces together with the things they carried. Since intrafederal and external borders must necessarily be approached from various research perspectives and with different questions, FIBO organizes two distinct series of lectures, FeBinars, each with another focus, one on internal borders, the management of internal borders by federal states, the other on external borders, crossing federal borders, ancient and modern. And both series were initiated by the inaugural lecture given by Hans Beck on March the 7th, which focused on a case studies involving both intrafederal and extrafederal borders. Today, we inaugurate the FeBinar series, The Management of Internal Borders by Federal States, and this series, which will run for 3 years like the other one, aims to analyze how the Greek federal states dealt with the problem of internal intrafederal borders and border areas. Did border management policies aim at peaceful coexistence per se, or rather at a balance of power and stability? These and other questions we are asking presuppose other thorny issues. What borders are we talking about? The borders of the polis, of districts, between districts? What are the internal borders of federal states? What was the relationship of federal states to territory? How did they organize it? What was the relationship between territory and membership? And to what extent could the latter become more significant than territoriality? When, as a young doctoral student, I began to shift my interests from the problem of border disputes to ethnicity and federalism, Professor Funke was for me, along with other scholars, the author of rigorous and complex writing on which I had to crack my head open even before I began to think about what I wanted to study about federalism. And for me, it was a great thrill to visit him in Münster in 2013, and then again in 2019, and even a greater thrill to have him here as a guest in Trento. And I have so many questions for him. With many, I already assaulted him yesterday on the journey from Verona to Trento from the airport, but I throw in some of them. So what happens when a koinon acquires more power and expands, and thus external borders are shifted and internal borders become external borders? How does it organize the new territories it controls? What happens when a koinon incorporates other koina? And what effect does this have on the organization of the original territories? How are borders defined and how are they perceived? What is the connection between the organization of the original and new territories with previous tribal structures, Stammstaate? What happened when they collapsed? Did the breakdown of the institutional framework lead to a full-scale fragmentation, or did tribal solidarity survive? What were the implications for the organization of the territory, if any? We look forward to hearing from our guest, Professor Peter Funke, who needs no introduction, of course, but I'll just say a few words for the younger ones. Peter Funke studied at Münster and Köln and taught at Siegen and Münster. He directed the research project Historische Landeskunde des antiken Griechenland. He was pro-rector for teaching and student affairs at the University of Münster, as well as subject evaluator for ancient history and deputy chair of the Specialist Committee of Ancient World Studies for the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. He has been a member of the Kommission für Alte Geschichte und Epigraphik in the German Archaeological Institute since 1988 and an ordinary member of the German Archaeological Institute, as well as a project leader for Inscriptiones Graecae. Funke's research focuses on the history of the Greek state system from the Mycenaean to Roman times, Greek historiography, ancient regionalism, and historical geography, ancient constitutional history, ethnicity, and federalism. And I am delighted to give him the floor to talk about own and common reflections on the internal borders of Greek federal states. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Elena. Dear students, or let me say commilitones. And first of all, I want to thank Elena for the invitation, not only Elena, but also the whole IRC team. And many thanks for the very friendly introduction. For me, it's a great pleasure to be here in Trento once again. And my pleasure is even greater because I have been invited to contribute with my lecture to Elena's ERC project dedicated to the research field of ancient federalism, which is also, as Elena said, one of my favorite topics. It would be nice if I could contribute a few thoughts to the project and to the many questions Elena had. Not for all questions I can give an answer, especially the state. So I would like to begin my remarks with a quotation from Frank Walbenk's book, The Hellenistic World. Just a minute. Okay. I always like to refer to this citation because it sums up the importance of the federal states in Hellenistic time. In a world of monarchies, the federal states exemplify the continuing ability of the Greeks to respond to a new political challenge with new solutions. One is bound to ask whether, given another century without Rome, federalism might not have developed fresh and fruitful aspects. Federalism offered the possibility of transcending the limitations of size and relative weakness of the separate city-state, but time ran out. In the third and the second centuries BC, the Greek world of states had transformed into a world of federal states, in which the polis of Athens became a solitaire. However, there were no legal forms or structures that were uniform and typically for all federal states. The genesis of the Greek federal states and their respective configurations were not only extremely diverse, but their development was also characterized by a great deal of dynamism. The institutional legal framework conditions were often subject to strong processes of change, especially in the third and second centuries. During this period, the world of Greek federal states resembled a large, unique field of experimentation. However, the Greek world of states has been a field of experimentation for the institutional design of state structures, not only since Hellenistic times. Please allow me to elaborate a little further at this point in order to clarify some prerequisites for the following explanation. Herodotus summarized the entirety of the Greek states under the terms polis kai ethne, city-states and tribal states. The polis and ethne, however, were not rigid and immovable entities. Rather, they were politically configurations that could also change in response to changing power political circumstances. This was true not only for the polis and ethne, but above all, for the organization of interstate relations. Thus, as early as the 5th century BC, against the background of the power political conflicts at that time, new forms of cooperation developed beyond the polis and ethne, which offered alternatives to the symmachiae. This is where the sympolitaiae came into play as new options. While in a symmachia, the existence of each member state was basically preserved and political independence was explicitly guaranteed to all allies, in a so-called sympolitaia, the autonomy of the contracted parties was at least partially abolished. This is a special legal form of citizenship that was intended to ensure political participation in an organization integrated several states. We are dealing here with an at least partial abolition of state autonomy. We are dealing with an extreme form of political border crossing. The creation of such a political structures offered new possibilities to overcome the obvious weaknesses of Greece's multi-state world. New options opened up for balancing the self-interests of individual states and the requirements of a policy that transcended these states. Let me illustrate this with an example. It needs a little time to give this explanation, but I think it's clarified the transition from symmachia to sympoliteia. From the early years of the 4th century, sometimes before 385, dates an agreement between the Mantineans and the Heliconians, in which the integration of the Western Akkadian city Helicon into the polis Mantinea was agreed upon. That's the text of this inscription. Resolved by the Mantineans and Heliconians, the Heliconians shall be Mantineans, equal and alike, sharing in all the things in which the Mantineans share too, conveying their land, their chora, and their city polis to Mantinea. And then the city, the polis of the Heliconians remaining as it is for all time, the Heliconians being a come, a village, or it's a special term of a part of such a sympoliteia, being a come of the Mantineans. Okay. About the previous history of the relations between Mantinea and Helicon, Helicon is more than 15 kilometers away from Mantinea. The following should be noted. Thucydides' account shows that during the Acidamian War, the Mantineans had succeeded in establishing their own sphere of power in southwestern Arcadia, which also extended to the Manilian area to which Helicon belonged, and even far beyond. The sphere of power, characterized by Thucydides as a symmachia, this power of Mantinea, may have been structured on a small scale, very similarly to the large hegemonic symmachiae of, for example, the Delic-Attic League or the Peloponnesian League. It is only too understandable that the Spartans made every effort to break up such a power structure within their own sphere of influence, within their own Symmachia. Therefore, when Mantinea had to agree to a peace with Sparta after 418, one of the key points of the peace treaty was the obligation of the Mantineans to give up the rule over the polis, ten achen aphesan ton poleon, the Herrschaft, the rule over the polis, and thus to relinquish control over large parts of Arcadia. It remains to be noted, therefore, that at least from the mid of the 20s of the 5th century until 418, Helisson, like other, I would say most other Manalian communities, was linked to Mantinea by a treaty of Symmachia. These contractual relations were then forcibly broken off by the Spartan-Mantinean peace. At the beginning of the 4th century, however, the Mantineans made a renewed attempt to expand their position of power, especially vis-à-vis Sparta, by expanding their body of citizens through Sympoliteia treaties. In this way, they tried to regain their sphere of influence, which had been taken away from them by the peace treaty with Sparta. The fact that Mantinea now used sympolitical instead of Symmachial connections was a clever move to undermine the clauses of the peace treaty. A Sympoliteia could, unlike in the case of a Symmachia, be passed off as an internal affair that left the relationship with Sparta untouched. Moreover, a Sympoliteia could guarantee a much stronger cohesion. Thus, the Mantineans were already operating with a set of instruments of state law at the beginning of the 4th century, which they then used again with greater success when they founded the Arcadian League after 370 BC. However, the legal content of the Sympoliteiae differed. The treaty with Helisson corresponded to the type of Sympoliteia in which a new common body of citizens was founded, but without changing the urban structures. The basis of the Arcadian League was a special form of Sympoliteia based on a new, let me say, a new principle of a so-called double citizenship. The citizens of the individual member states of a federal Sympoliteia always received federal citizenship along with the acquisition of citizenship of a member state. I will come back to this later. However, as is well known, the Arcadian League of the 4th century was not the first attempt to create a federal state structure. After the defeat of the Spartans at Leuctra, the League was founded after 371 with Boeotian support and probably also on the model of the Boeotian League. In Boeotia, a federal organization had already been established in the course of the 5th century. In Achaia, in the Peloponnese, and in large parts of central and northwestern Greece, the development of federal structures had already progressed gradually at the turn of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Likewise, at that time, under the leadership of Olympe, also the cities in the Chalkidiki had united to form a federal Sympoliteia. That's the situation at the end of the 5th century and the beginning of the 4th century. But when the unconditional autonomy of every Greek state was stipulated in the so-called King Peace of 386, the Spartans used the treaty clause of autonomy to crush any cross-state alliance system. However, the success of these efforts was short-lived. As early as the 70s of the 4th century, some political alliances were revived and newly founded, which then became the determining political forces in the Greek world of states in the following centuries. This finally created the political experimental field on which the emerging federal states had to search for suitable institutional and legal design for their constitution. The structural framework conditions of a federal sympoliteia were given. The dynamic interrelations between the central power and the individual member states were characteristic. On the basis of joint agreements, the member states had transferred some of their own state competencies to the federal level and placed them at the disposal of the entire federation. This mainly concerned questions of foreign and defense policy, but also large areas of legislation and jurisdiction. The aim was to divide the areas of competence between the central power and the member states in such a way that a balance was ensured. The division of competences between the federal power and the member states did not follow any fixed rules, but were structured quite differently in the individual federal states and was also repeatedly adapted to the changing needs of the member states in course of time. Moreover, the areas of competence of the federal government and the member states were not always clearly separated from each other, but could, as in modern federal states also, be in a competing relationship with each other and then required mutual coordination. It was of fundamental importance to ensure the participation of every citizen in all political decisions, both at the level of the respective home state and at the level of the federal state. It was therefore essential that the acquisition of citizenship of a member state was always associated with a federal citizenship, even if the legal form of this double citizenship could vary greatly from state to state. I would leave it at this point with my very general remarks on the diversity and the structural commonalities of Greek federal states. I've highlighted the bipolar tension between the member states and the federal authority and the resulting need for a balance of power. I can dispense here with more detailed remarks on the broad spectrum of efforts to achieve such a balance. I've published a summary of the current state of research together with many, many colleagues in a volume edited by Hans Beck and myself about federalism some years before. However, the internal structure of the federal states was not only characterized by bipolar relations between federal authority and member states. There was also, let me say, something between. These were intermediate levels with their own areas of responsibility. With the federal state, several member states could be grouped into districts, tele or mare. These districts were firmly delimited as the territories of each member state and also as the territory of an entire federal state as the sum of all territories of the respective member states. For the EIC project, Federalism and Border Management in Greek Antiquity, the districts of a federal state are therefore of interest. And therefore, in the following, I will focus on the forms and functions of these bordered intermediate levels. I must say, however, that the existence of districts can only be proven with certainty in very, very few cases. Their functionality often remains very vague. Due to the disparate sources, the districts can only be inferred indirectly, so that some consideration must remain hypothetical. This is probably also the reason why the districts received relatively little attention for a long time. It was only until Thomas Korsten made them the subject of a comprehensive comparative analysis in his book Vom Stamm zum Bund. And also Chiara Lassani has recently sketched a very differentiated picture of the districts. Sorry, I'm too, that's the problem. She has recently sketched a differentiated picture of the districts in several publications. This is the last one from 2019, or one of the last. And okay. In the following, I would like to question the picture sketched by Thomas Korsten, according to which all federal states were divided into districts according to a uniform pattern and the same principles. There was undoubtedly something between, with the power structure of member states and central power within. But the spectrum of the circumscribed interstices seems to have been more diverse than often assumed. Let us look at this a little bit more closely. The starting point for an analysis of the internal structures of ancient federal states is always the Boeotian Confederation. In Boeotia, the federal forms of organization were established particularly early, probably at the turn of the 6th to the 4th, 5th century. After an interim dissolution of these structures, the federation had then refounded in 447, which was associated with a profound structural change. The introduction of federal state structures sought to ensure a maximum of communality after the experiences of the preceding period had taught that the ethnic ties were no longer sufficient to absorb the centrifugal forces that had been unleashed to claim of individual Boeotian polis to political autonomy in the past. The detailed description of the Boeotian federal constitution, handed down by the so-called author of the Hellenica of Oxyrhynchos, gives us a picture of an institutional organization in which the responsibilities of central power and member states were clearly demarcated each other. This is a text. I give you only a sketch. I don't want to read it because of time reasons. Above all member states were grouped proportionally in their size into 11 districts, in such a way that each district was of equal size. All political, fiscal, and military rights and duties were distributed equal among the districts. The author of the Hellenica describes very clearly the key function of the districts, and then he concludes, to put it simply, each community shared equally in public burdens and benefits. That means kai met echon panton homoios, kai kakon, kai agaton. It's very common. The division of the districts was carried out according to purely quantitative criteria, which were intended to ensure the met-echon apanton homoios. Due to time of constraints, I have to dispense with more detailed review of the text, but the following figures can perhaps illustrate the basic principles I want to show you. These are the different districts of the, I have the German, the districts of the Bohusian League. And this could show you the different districts and the equally participation of every district to send Buleuten is members of the council, to send a Boyotag, it's the highest magistrate in the Bohusian League, and to send every district have to send 1,000 hoplites and 100 cavalrymen. Yeah. Geographical contexts were only taken into account to a limited extent, and despite all efforts to make the division parity, Thebes was nevertheless able to take a certain position of precedence, which I will not go into here, however. The constitutional order lasted from 447 until the dissolution of the federation in 386. Whether the new federation, founded a few years later in the 70s, under the leadership of Thebes, was also divided into districts, must remain an open question. The unique amount of the Bohusian constitution in the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia has become a striking point of reference for the analysis of the other ancient federal states as well. In research, it's often assumed that this Bohusian constitution can be regarded as a kind of blueprint for the other ancient federal states. Such an approach, however, narrows the view of the possible diversity of federal manifestations, especially with regard to the intermediate institutional levels in question here. This can be illustrated very well by my second case study, the Akkadian Confederation. As a result of the Spartan defeat at Leuctra, the previously independent Akkadian communities were united with Bohusian support in the years between, let me say, 371, 369. And a sense of ethnic belonging together may have played an important role in this. However, the individual states in Arcadia had developed apart in the past and were now anxious to maintain their independence as far as possible. On the other hand, the Akkadians had come to realize that in view of the profound changes caused by the collapse of the Spartan supremacy, a closer alliance, state alliance, could only be advantageous. This tension between opposing interests led to the constitution to a federal state whose supreme decision-making body was the Federal Assembly, and in this Federal Assembly, all decisions concerning the federation as a whole were taken. A council was also involved in the decision-making to which the individual member states sent representatives. However, neither the number of representatives sent to the council by the individual member states, nor the total number of all council members is known. Conclusions about a probable proportional representation of the individual member states in the central bodies of the federation can at best be drawn from the composition of a board of 50 daimyō at the end of a decree of honor passed by the Federal Assembly, the Myrioi, and the Boulé of the Akkadians. This is the beginning of this honorary decree. There's mentioned the central institutions, the hoi myrioi, the 10,000, but we have had in mind, in my opinion, that the 10,000 will not indicate a restriction of access to the Federal Assembly, however conditions, but was probably only a designation of a numerically undefined larger number and stood for the totality of federal citizens. But for us, more interesting is the list of all the daimyo goi, which is annexed to this decree. And yeah, the function of these daimyo goi cannot be clearly clarified. Either there were a committee of the council or an independent committee that conducted the day-to-day business of the federation together with the federal magistrates. As a rule, each member state could send 5 members to this board of daimyo goi, with the exception of Megalopolis, the newly funded federal capital, which provided 10 daimyo goi, and Leprion and Mainalion, which provided only 3 and 2 representatives, respectively. It is possible that the number of the daimyo goi depended on the size of the respective sending city. But the number 5 seems to have been a standard number. Perhaps it could be seen here. And therefore, looking for this 5 as a standard number, Pierre Salmon has proposed that the list of the daimyo goi is based on a district division of the Akkadian League modeled on the Boeotian League as described in the Hellenica Auxurionia. In Salmon's view, each of the 7 poleis mentioned in the inscription, each of which provided 5 daimyo goi, represented a district. Megalopolis, because of its size, had formed 2 districts, while Leprion and Mainalion had been combined into a single district. Jim Roy and Thomas Heine Nielsen guessed, citation, that the absence of attested members may suggest, because there are not all cities who were members of the federal state, the absence of the attested members suggests that the daimyo goi were recruited from different communities on a rotational basis. And Salmon thus assumes that a total of 10 districts, largely balanced in size, would have formed the basic federal structures of the Akkadian Confederation. Here you can see the idea of Salmon. But it's even more difficult. Some of Salmon's reflections are captivating, even if his ideas on numerical composition of the Federal Assembly and the Council, look here, that's the idea of Salmon, remain very speculative and lack any evidence. Nevertheless, the assumption of a division of the Akkadian League into districts remains the thesis worth considering, but not yet be provable with certainty. Especially on the right side, the members of the assembly and the Beloiten numbers are very speculative. But the districts, it's a good idea, I think. It is even more difficult to prove the division of districts of the Achaean League. The Achaean League is our 3rd case study. In Achaia II, the formation of federal structures was already well developed by the end of the 5th century. the temporary integration of the polis Calydon, situated on the northern coast of the Gulf of Patras and actually belonging to Aetolia, the integration into the Achaean state, which took place sometimes before 389, this integration can hardly be explained otherwise than the existence of such a sympoliteia function. The situation in Achaea had already changed to such an extent that here too, it was no longer the ethnic belonging, but a sympolitical connection of the individual member states that was decisive, so that in principle, states outside Achaea could also be integrated into the Achaean League. However, no statements can be made about any districts within the Confederation at that time. Only for the period after the refoundation of the League in 281, more than 100 years later, do we have a few corresponding references, which are to be extracted almost exclusively from the Historia of Polybius, and with which only a very incomplete picture can be sketched. Only one district can be proven with certainty. Polybius mentioned in various contexts a Synteleia Patricae, which consists of the cities Patrae, Tritaia, Dyme, and Pharae, and which apparently served mainly military purposes. Look here, this is the first, mentioned by Polybius. In a special context, he's speaking of a Synteleia Patricae, district of Patrae, and there are other mentions of this Synteleia, because he's talking about the levies of Dyme, Patrae, and Pharae. And then he's speaking about the people of Patrae and those who contributed assistance together with them. Patres de tom meta tuton syntelikon. And the last one, it's in Polybius' fourth book. But because of Dyme, who happened at that time to be substrategos of the Achaean League, went out to rescue with a body of Dymaeans, Pharaeans, and Tritaians, and attacked and so on and so on. These are the only mention of this district of Patrae in Polybius. And there has been no lack of attempt to find arguments for the existence of further Synteleia. So Aldo Ferrabino, 100 years ago, for example, put forward the thesis that two further Synteleia had been established in connection with the reform of the military system carried out by Aratos in the end of the 3rd century. In my opinion, however, the corresponding remarks of Polybius don't permit such a far-reaching conclusion. Thomas Gorsten also assumes an overall division into districts. He invokes the coincidence of historiographical traditions and argues that the entire territory of the Achaean League was divided into districts along proportional lines. On the basis of an epigraphically preserved list of the nomographs, he attempts to prove that the League was divided into 5 equally sized districts. But even these interesting considerations remain too vague and are not verifiable. As long as no new sources teach us otherwise, we will have to stick to the idea that there was indeed only one district with the towns of Patrae, Dyme, Tritaia, and Pharae. This was also the opinion of Jacob Larsen. He assumed that these 4 cities, which had newly founded the Archaic League in 281, remained organized in this district as the founding members of the Achaean League. as a special group. This argumentation too must ultimately remain hypothetical. In any case, it's relevant to our question of internal borders within a federal state, that there could have been intermediate levels that were not always area-wide and structures according to proportional principles. When we now turn to the Acarnanian League, we are not at all moving on a firmer ground. In this case, too, a possible division into districts can only be deduced indirectly from sources. The key document, and also the only relevant source, is a treaty between the Acarnanian and the Aetolian League from the year 263. The content of this treaty, which is extremely important for the history of Central Greece in the 3rd century, will not concern us here. It's very interesting, but it's impossible to speak about this. For our question of a possible district division, however, the very detailed dating form of this treaty is instructive. Both contractual partners list here an extensive ensemble of the federal offices. For the Acarnanian League, there are a board of 7 strategoi, as well as a hipparchos, a grammatos, and a tamias. These are only the names and I didn't give the translation because you can see it's in 7 names of strategoi. The fact that each strategos came from a different polis suggests that the territory of the federation was divided into as many districts. These are the different places from which the strategoi are coming. And as the Theodokoi lists from Nemea and Epidauros name a large number of cities than the 7 from which the strategoi mentioned in this treaty came. And therefore, Thomas Corsten and Chiara Lassani were probably right to assume that each district could include several polis, and that these polis sent officials to represent their districts according to a rotation system. And by the way, also the highest executive level of the Confederation was apparently filled according to a rotation system in such a way that the 3 highest offices were assigned to citizens from one and the same district in an annual rotation. Look here, these are the most important offices of the Acarnanian. Just a moment. These are the first highest offices. The strategos, he is coming from Oniadai, on the south part of Acarnania. The hipparchos, one of the most important military leaders, and the grammatos, the writer, the secretary. And these all come from one city. And we have other documents of the Acarnanian League, where we can see that also in other years there is the same system of that the magistrates, the highest magistrate, came from one and the same city. So, but that is our most important is the districts. Corsten and Lassani have attempted to geographically locate the districts based on the treaty and the Theodorokoi lists. Yeah. Both assume a distribution that differs only slightly, but not important, but which in principle could well be right to one, this distribution. It's very interesting to see this, and I think it's okay. Also, there's no final certainty. There is a considerable evidence to suggest that the district organization of the Acarnanian League had similar structures and functions to those of the Boeotian League described in the Hellenic Auxonia. How long this district organization lasted remains an open question and insolvable question. Chiara-Lassani has rightly stated that in the case of his continuance, there must have been a reform of this structure since the territory of the League has shrunk considerably in the 3rd century. But evidence, once again, is lacking. The last stop on our search for districts in the Greek states is to be the Aetolian Confederation. In this case, too, the treaty between the Acarnanian and Aetolian League from the year 263, mentioned above, is a key document. In the dating form, the Aetolian side mentions a board of 7 epilectarchontes. Epilectarchontes, that means a kind of military commanders, and a board of 7 tamiae, treasurers, in addition to the strategos, the hipparchos, and the grammatos. These two 7-member boards are repeatedly taken as an indication that the entire Aetolian Confederation was also divided into districts as the Acarnanian League. Thomas Corsten, for example, assumed that there must have been 7 equally sized districts organized according to the principle of proportionality and representativeness, which also included the non-Aetolian territories integrated into the League. Unlike in the case of the Acarnanian League, however, there's not the slightest evidence for such a conjecture. However, as long as the list of the Aetolian federal magistrates in the Aetolian Acarnanian Treaty remains the only relevant source, all considerations regarding a district division of the entire federal territory must remain hypothetical, especially since the ethnicity of the military and financial officials mentioned in the treaty hardly allows for reliable conclusions. Chiara-Lassani recently emphasized this point with reference to the following tables. Here you see the different places and the different cities from which the epilectarchoi, the military commanders, and the tamiae, the treasurers, are coming. Some of the ethnica, the indication of the origins, cannot be localized, and the geographical scattering of the remaining ethnica rather suggests that the selection of these magistrates was probably made at the federal level, and no consideration was given to an equal representation of all parts of the Aetolian League. You see, most cities are cities from Locris, but especially from Aetolia in the center of the federation, the old territory of Aetolia. In this context, reference has repeatedly made to the telos stratikon, a district of Stratos, and the telos lokrikon, district of Locris, whose existence within the Aetolian League is attested for the second half of the 3rd century and the first half of the 2nd century, respectively. Here are the examples. First of all, we have an inscription from the 30s, perhaps between 235 to 230. It's a border dispute settlement, Krima Gaikon, Stratiku Telos, a decision of the Telos, of the district of Stratos. Next one, this is a dating formula of a manumission. Bulachon, also ein Bulachos of the Locricon telos, of the locus, of the telos of Locris, or the Locrian telos. And it's not only interesting to have the name of these two tele, but also the duties. It's a border dispute, it's a manumission, it's not only for military cases and so on and so on. And we have two further dating formulas of manumission decrees according to datings according to Bulachoi of the telos Locricon. The supplements here is I can't give all the arguments for the supplements, but the supplements are in this from a context, and they are sure. These districts, the tele, apparently had their own political institutions, areas of competences, and magistrates. Chiara Lassini has been able to prove that the Bulachoi of the tele are to be distinguished from the Bulachoi acting at the level of the federation. There were also Bulachoi, and sometimes it was said, as we said, that these Bulachoi of the level of the federation are the same, are representatives of the tele. But Chiara Lassini had very, very good reasons and she can with certainty show that we must differentiate, we must make the difference between these two Bulachoi. And as I said, these were independent magistrates at the level of the tele. In the tele, one has also wanted to see evidence of a comprehensive district division of the federation according to a geographical division principle. That's another aspect. And Thomas Corsten therefore equated these tele with districts which he believed he could derive from the Aetolian-Acarnanian Treaty as a parallel. The tele mentioned in the inscriptions known so far, however, can only be proven, that's an important thing, can only be proven for the territories that were next to the Aetolian Confederation in the late 4th century and in the 3rd century, but not for the original tribal territories of the Aetolian League, for the center territories. The center territories are here, as you can see it here. There is therefore much to suggest, in my opinion, that the introduction of the tele was connected with the integration of originally non-Aetolian ethne and koina into the Aetolian Confederation. In this way, the member states of formerly independent koina were granted at least a certain equivalent for the dissolution of their own federal organization associated with entry into the Aetolian Confederation. So far, only the district around the former Acarnanian city of Stratos and the West Locrian district can be reliably proven in the sources. However, there were probably also other districts for other regions of central Greece, as far as they were fully integrated in the Aetolian League. At least the central Greek countryside of Doris, in the eastern part, you can see it, it's a small region on the right side, in the eastern part of the Aetolian territory. At least the central Greek countryside of Doris also seems to have formed its own telos during the membership of the Aetolian League. This suggested by an inscription from Xanthos in Asia Minor, dated 206, in which contains several documents concerning a delegation from the Polis Cutanian of Doris, which was then part of the Aetolian League. It's a complicated but a very interesting ensemble of its decrees and answers of decrees, but I can't speak only about one point. But it's interesting also for your research project too. The Xantians' reply to the Cutanians is revealing. They emphasize their goodwill, their oinoia, their goodwill towards the koinon of the Dorians and the polis of the Cutanians, prosteton koinon ton Dorion, kaitein Cutanion polin. Moreover, it is noteworthy that the decision of the Aetolian League authorizing the sending of the delegation was addressed to the cities of Doris as a whole, and not only to the Cutanians. It therefore remains to be considered whether the differentiation made in the letter of the Xantians between the polis of the Cutanians, the koinon of the Dorians, and the other Aetolians may be an indication of the existence of a telos Doricon, whose polis were nevertheless members of the federation in their own right. However, this consideration also cannot be proven with certainty and must therefore remain hypothetically. I say always the same, it's a pity, but it is. Chiara Lassani is also skeptical about the existence of a telos Doricon. But nevertheless, and I think that is more important, nevertheless, also for Chiara Lassani too, the Aetolian League's treatment of the city of Cutanion in the Doris and the establishment of the tele of Stratos and Locris are examples of the federal state's ability to preserve pre-existing networks of ties and hierarchies. It was a primarily political rather than an ethnogeographical aspect that determined the formation of these stelae. It was not a question, I would say, as Thomas Kosten assumes, that it was a question of breaking up the newly acquired territories administratively in order to keep possible separatist aspirations better under control. I think that it's not possible to give this interpretation. Rather, the existence of these stelae could serve to maintain the identity of the koina, of the Locrians, Dorians, Anians, Oetaians, etc., and each of which was split into numerous politically independent member states of the Aetolian Federation. This may also explain why the koina in central Greece, which were re-established after 168, were able to function and act independently, again, surprisingly quickly, despite the fact that some of them had been integrated into the Aetolian Confederation for a very, very long time. So, I hope that by looking for districts in ancient federal states, I've been able to make it clear that districts did not always have to be entities of equal size organized according to the principle of proportionality and representativeness, but could also fulfill quite different forms of function. The boundaries within a federal state could therefore be just a diverse and sometimes undetermined. Between the level of the member states and the level of the central authority, there could not only be a third level, but a multitude of differently delimited intermediate spaces. I would therefore like to understand my contribution as an appeal for a differentiated view of internal borders. So there's much to do in the EIC project. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Funke, for this very rich overview. You provided an overview of the problem of the districts in many different COINA. And now I would say I open the floor to debate. For those connected online, we are using webinar Zoom, so you have to write your question not in the chat, but in the box in the Q&A box. There is a special box. You only need to write your question there, but we can also open the floor to questions here in the room for our students and PhD students. So please. Immer so am Anfang. Well, you can ask your question in German, I think, in Italian, in English. The debate is in many languages. Oh, Alessandro. Wait for the mic. Thank you. We have a question here in the room by a student.
Thank you for your lecture, first of all. And I have a really basic question about federalism. By reading the new Larsen, I have had this thought that I wanted to ask you about, even if it is only contingently related to the topic at hand of Mere. It is a central problem of the study of federalism in ancient Greece. Was the double citizenship overrated? Because Larsen, of course, thought that it was the principal heuristic thing to look about around a federal state. But by reading the new Larsen, this called new Larsen, I have found a lot of quotation about applying caution to this principle. So what can you tell me about this really important topic?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's complicated with a double citizenship, doppeltes Bürgerrecht. It's a German expression because the origin is it's German of this. Not only the name, but also the model. I think it is a key to understand the federal and a key instrument for federal states. And we also have more examples for this double citizenship functioning. And I'm not so skeptical with this using this term to describe the basic principles of the federations. And yes, I see no I'm not convinced by the arguments against the existence of this double citizenship. And I think it's my opinion, and perhaps it's typical that he's studying this federation since so many years and he can't see the new solution for this. But I see no alternative to this principle to understand the functioning between these two levels. And there's, for example, there's a well-known treaty where the politeia the isopoliteia is given to a community in the islands in the Aegean island, in Chios. It's a very well treaty between Chios and Naupaktos, a Lokian city, and there you can see it's a very complicated. It's very complicated to describe the citizenship given to the Chian, because also the Aetolian level on the federal level has made a decision and so on. And we have this formulation in isopoliteia treaties, katatonomon. There must be Katatonomon, it's according the laws. And this is also for me an indication that there must be not a connection. There must be a combination between decisions on the federal side, on the federal level, and the member states level. I think, for me, it's always the key for this. And yeah.
Thank you. There are two questions online. The first one is by Benjamin Winnick, who writes, I have two questions. The first one is, can you speak a little bit about the role of Centelea in federations? And the second one is, what is the source for the maps that you were using? And then there are other two questions, but I will read them later on. So the role of Centelea. Thank you for your question, Benjamin.
I think also it's very difficult to give a precise description of the Centelea. If we are looking for the mentions in Polybius, there we have only the question of military organization and so on and so on. And therefore, I see no reason to give more information about the duties of the Centelea and of the rights of the Centelea. Therefore, it's because of the information of Polybius, the military aspect is in the foreground. And it's a meager and insufficient. Yeah, it could be that Polybius, it depends on Polybius' perspective, yes. It's a pity, but in my opinion, we have it's not sufficient to give more information about this. On the other side, there was a question, the maps. Directly, the maps, some of the maps are made by Michael Tieke, one of our collaborators, who's died in some months before. And the other map, for example, this one is from the New Pauli. I forget this to mark this. It's yeah. Is it enough, or is it?
We have other questions now. There is a question.
And the answer for the maps is okay?
Yeah, I think
okay.
You said everything, because most of them are from the new labs and from your book.
Yes,
most.
Yeah.
There is then a question by Jeremy McInerney, who writes, thank you. Many of the koina you have discussed today are among the larger koina known to us. Do you think that territorial units were necessary for the articulation of koina as megastates? I am thinking, you can read it here.
No.
If they are necessary for the articulation of koina as megastates, I am thinking of Bourriaud's way of reading tribes and Gene as helping to constitute Athens as a megapolis. Yes, wonderful question. You can read the question here by Jeremy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not so easy to answer this, because therefore I talked about the treaty between Mantinea and Helisson. And another example could be the structure of the Megaris also, because Megara and the relationship to Agostinai and so on must be the same construction. These were megastates. But on the other side, the greater leagues, Aetolian League and so on, the megastates is, I think, especially on the perspective of the Greek, the perspective of ancient Greece, I think it's not the right name. We can discuss this perhaps if we are looking for the smaller koina, but we have no idea about the structure of the smaller koina in Central Greece after 168. That's very difficult to speak about the structures of these, what is it, koina, a federal state, or are they so close together? Yeah, not religious association. It could, well, perhaps it could be something like more closer sympoliteia, like the sympoliteia between, perhaps between Mantinea and Edison. Therefore, it's difficult to answer this question. And yeah, the tribes and Gene helping to constitute Athens. It's, I think we can't compare this with the districts and other organizations, federal states. There is, I was thinking about this, especially in the case of the Cleisthenic reforms, how to organize proportionality by not by an artificial method. The different tritium and the creation of the phylae. These were interesting, an interesting system, but it was similar to the districts created in some federal states, but yeah, the result is it was the aim of Cleisthenics. If Cleisthenes, the aim was to create a common body of citizens. But on a federal state, the aim is to make a balance between a common, therefore the double citizenship, a common citizenship, and on the other side, to preserve the citizenship of every member states. And that's the difference between the districts and so on and so on and so on, of the districts of federal states and, let me say, the Cleisthenic system of phylae and so on and so on. Yeah, I hope, dear Jeremy, it's not, I hope you are content with this. Sebastian. Okay.
There's another question by Sebastian. So
Yeah, then consider.
There is one more question by Sebastian Scharf, who writes, thank you for this very rich presentation and your search for federal districts. You painted a very diverse picture and emphasized the plurality of the federal worlds. What does this mean for the question of intentional border management? Are these possibly different ways of dealing with districts an indicator of the existence of intentional strategies of dealing with inner borders? This is an issue. We had many debates about this in our internal workshops.
Yes.
With Sebastian and Claudio.
The question of intentional border management.
Oh.
Yeah. In the case of the tele, we could think about this. If I'm right, if my interpretation is the right interpretation. But in the case of the districts who served as a medium to create proportionality, absolutely, without any respect of ethnicity or others, then it's difficult to say it's intentional. Intentional means more than to create only proportionality. And therefore it could be, I think, we were talking about only about the Aetolian tele, but perhaps there are much more other intermediate levels which we can create, where the borders are not so fixed, are not. It's very difficult to determine the borders. Therefore, intentionally, yes, it could be a possibility, but only for such cases as a tele, as I interpreted them. Yeah.
Sometimes the aim, sometimes only the effect, maybe. There is a question by Thomas Korsten. Should I read this question?
Yeah.
And then I give you the... Zwei Fragen von Thomas Korsten. Erste Frage. In den beiden Inschriften aus Naupactos ist der Name des Distrikts Locricon-Telos nur ergänzt. Zudem stammt der Bulach aus Agrignon. Agrignon ist aber keine lokrische Stadt.
Ja,
Wie ist das zu erklären? Und die zweite Frage. Wenn das dorische Koinon in der Inschrift aus Xanthos ein Distrikt war, warum wurde es dann nicht Telos genannt, wie die anderen Distrikte?
Warum nicht?
Telos, wie die anderen.
Ja, das sind zwei Fragen. Auf der einen Seite die Frage des Agrignon-Buleuten. Das ist Bularchen, nicht Buleuten. Herr Korsen, das ist die Frage hat, glaube ich, Chiara ganz gut gelöst, Chiara Lassani, denn sie trennt ja das von die Funktion der Bularchen auf der Telos-Ebene und macht sie zu eigenen administrativen Bezirken. Und sie sieht in der Tat, ich glaube auch mit Recht, nicht unbedingt damit zwingend, dass dieser Mensch aus Lokris kommen muss, sondern dass das durchaus administrativ auch anders zu regeln ist. Da hat sie länger drüber ja argumentiert. Und ich glaube, das geht so. Wobei ich allerdings auch sagen muss, in der Inschrift, die Ergänzung Agrignon scheint mir immer noch, aber dem kann ich jetzt nicht nachgehen. Ich muss das nochmal bei den IG nochmal prüfen, ob die entsprechenden Abklatsch haben. So ganz sauber ist das nicht mit der Erklärung mit Agrignon, mit der Lesung. Die ist ja hin und her geschoben worden. Aber dennoch, das soll strukturell würde ich mich da der Chiara Lassani anschließen. Ja, und das andere ist in der Tat, das ist eine Unsicherheit mit dem Doricon Telos. Das ist von mir so eine Idee gewesen. Ich glaube auch, es muss existiert haben eine eigene Sphäre, nennen wir das mal dorische Sphäre. Warum die Xantier das nicht Telos nennen, sondern Koinon? Ich weiß es nicht. Ich würde auch nicht so weit gehen, dass ich sage, ja, das ist noch der alte Begriff, da ist das Koinon. Es gibt ja noch den Streit, wie stark war die Doris vor der Integration in den aetolischen Mund schon ein ausgeprägtes Koinon. All das würde ich nicht sagen. Ich habe dafür einfach offen gesagt auch keine endgültige Lösung. Aber wichtig scheint mir zu sein, darum auch selbst wenn es dieses Doricon Telos nicht gegeben hat, wichtig scheint mir zu sein, dass man das als eine eigene Ansprechebene sowohl in diesem Konvolut der Inschriften nennen wir das mal auf der aetolischen Seite, wie auch in der Antwort der Xantia drauf hat. Und ich sage, das müssen wir, glaube ich, stärker gewichten, als das bisher der Fall war. Das wäre, ne? Also ich hänge nicht an diesem Teller, dieses Teller ist einfach nur mal eine Denkfigur gewesen, ob man das durchkriegt. Bemerkenswert ist diese Trennung noch zwischen Kythinion und der Doris als eine eigene Ebene, die da angesprochen wird, auch in dem ganzen Konvolut. Und das muss irgendwie eine Lösung finden. Auch Denis Rousset hat ja in seinem Beitrag durchaus, ist er auch skeptisch und sagt, ja, eigentlich haben wir erst diese dorische Koinon ab 168 wirklich, wo wir das greifen können. Wie das vorher aussah, wissen wir nicht. Und also ich möchte wirklich sagen, das ist eine Hypothese, die ich aufstelle, aber dennoch, das geht sogar in die intentionalen Distrikte herein. Offenbar existiert das Bewusstsein einer größeren Gemeinschaft und sie ist ansprechbar und bezeichnenbar in einem diplomatischen Verkehr. Das ist der Punkt. Ein Gruß auch an den Kosten.
Thank you. Any more questions here in the room or online? Vittorio, a student of Filologia and Critica Letteraria. He will spend a period in Freiburg next year.
We have been talking about Arcadia, and I wanted to ask you, given that a foundational myth is attested for the region, I'm thinking about Pelasgus and his son, which proves the kinship of the cities of Arcadia. And also the ethnonym Arcades is attested in the Iliad.
Yeah.
And do you think that there were factors which obstaculated the formation of a ethnic state before the Arcadian Confederation in 370, or was it a natural development?
About something like a confederation before the foundation. You mean before the foundation? Yes. Of Sian? There must be, because I think that the creation, the foundation of the Arcadian koinon could not be an absolutely new creation. But on the other side, we have no information about a real state structure of an Arcadian community. But the identity of the Arcadians is present in this time. And perhaps the Mantineans spielen mit, wie sagt man das? The Mantineans not exploit. The Mantineans could use the Arcadian mentality to for the creation of this sub-Symmachia under the Spartan Symmachia. I think that there must be a point where they can anchor this own sphere of influence created in the time of the Peloponnesian War in the 20s. It could be, there must be something of this. We have, we have also the coins of the Archidicon, and it's a much debate about this. What is the identity in the 5th century? But to speak about a state construction as a state, there's no information about this. The identity, yes, and absolutely. Therefore, this the belonging together. This is the most instrument to create this league. It must have a fundament in Ray. You see in Delphi the Arcadian monument, and it's playing with these with these intentional communities. But we need more information. If there were more than an ethnic belonging, the coins of the 5th century could be an indication of could be I would say must be an indication of the belonging together. But how strong is the construction as an own state? It's difficult to say. Perhaps because the dissolution in different polis, autonomous polis, is beginning in the 5th century, and perhaps the coins could be an expression of longing together, also as different polis, Arcadian polis. Archidicon is.
Thank you.
This.
Any more questions in the room? Otherwise, there is a question by a student.
I wanted to ask, maybe it could sound a little bit a provocation, but you said that, and many others said that Koinon could be alternatives for Symmachia. But I was thinking, is it not maybe that Symmachia are forms of government carried out by stronger police, and maybe Koinon are a way of expanding of smaller and weaker communities, and maybe could be the difference can be outlined this way.
It's not an opposition, Symmachia and Sympolitei, but the Sympolitei of the 5th and 4th century and so on are a new instrument to form a new kind of working together, of acting together without an hegemonic structure. On the other side, in Thebes, for example, you have these Boeotian League of 447 to 386, but 10 years later, and that you can see the tension between hegemonic, the will to be a hegemonic power, and on the other side to create a community, a federation of communities, of states, of member states, because in the 70s they created a common in Thebes. Thebes was an imperial power. It was also in the former Boeotian League a leading power, but now Thebes is creating its position by the creation of an assembly, not a federal assembly, the assembly of all the Boeotians. And on the one side, you can say, oh, it's more democratic and so on. But on the other side, it's a fundament of Theban's dominance in this construction. And therefore, one cannot say it's an opposition between Symmachia and Syntelleia. I wanted only to say that the Syntelleia, in their different forms, widened the toolbox, the toolbox of the for the instrument to create new polisübergreifend. Das ist immer schwer zu sagen. Overall, normally we say suprapolis, yeah, suprapolis structures. And that's interesting. Therefore I began with the citation of Warbank to show the feeling for the experimental character of the state formations in the 3rd and 2nd century. And therefore we must look for the differentiation, for the different forms. And also the Symmachia, for example, the Second Athenian League of the 4th century, you see, also the Symmachia were acting, were functioning in the 4th century. But it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Also because we have some koina which are some way in between. You cannot say if they are Sympoliteia. In some periods they are closer to Symmachia. I'm also thinking of the Chalcidians or even the Opuntians, where the city of Opus is very strong.
Yeah.
Sorry for skipping in that way, but it's so an interesting question. It is also very late, so if we have no other questions, I would say I'm very grateful to Professor Funke for this talk and for the debate, and grateful to everyone who followed us both here in the room and online. And remind you our next appointment, which is on June the 13th with Alex Macaulay, speaking on under and or through the border, proxeny across federal borders in the Hellenistic Peloponnese. Many thanks, and go federal.
Many thanks also from my side. And oh, sure.